What is Zionism? Zionism is a religious and political effort that facilitated the creation of a Jewish state in modern-day Israel, based on both ancestral and biblical ties to the region, particularly in the area roughly corresponding to Canaan, the Holy Land, the region of Palestine, or Eretz Israel, on the basis of a long Jewish connection and attachment to that land. As is well known, Zionism has brought thousands of Jews from around the world back to their ancient homeland in the Middle East and re-established Israel as the central location for Jewish identity. While some critics call Zionism an aggressive and discriminatory ideology, the Zionist movement has successfully established a Jewish homeland in the nation of Israel. History of Zionism, a brief sketch. If we recall, in 70 AD, the Romans destroyed the Second Temple in Jerusalem, a highly important site in Judaism, kickstarting the spread of a Jewish diaspora across the world and causing a significant decline in the region's Jewish population. And then, during the Muslim conquests of the 7th century, Islam was brought to Palestine. Islam was then solidified as the region's de facto religion by the Ottoman Empire from the 17th century onwards. The following century saw the rise of the Haskalah movement, or Jewish Enlightenment movement, which urged Jews to assimilate into Western secular culture. However, opposition to the movement emerged in the late 1800s, led by Theodor Herzl, a Jewish journalist, philosopher, and writer from Austria-Hungary, who countered that such assimilation could never be achieved in the face of rapidly rising antisemitism in Europe. In 1897, Herzl convened the first Zionist Congress in the Swiss city of Basel, at which he stated that Zionism strives to create for the Jewish people a home in Palestine secured by public law. Because of this move, Herzl was considered by many as the father of political Zionism. The movement then has secured support among Western European governments, particularly after Zionists agreed to create their Jewish state in historic Palestine. The Zionists' early objective was to claim as much of historic Palestine as possible by driving out the Palestinian population. The Zionists actively encouraged the mass migration of European Jews to Palestine during the first half of the 20th century. Despite their efforts, and the sharp rise in antisemitism in Europe culminating in the Nazi persecution, Arabs still outnumbered Jews in Palestine. Thus, as the likes of Israeli historian Elon Papp have argued, Zionist leaders were well aware that implementing their project would necessitate the ethnic cleansing of the indigenous Palestinian population. In 1948, David Ben-Gurion, then head of the World Zionist Organization, proclaimed the founding of the State of Israel in Palestine. Zionists argued that Israel would provide a safe national home for Jews, allowing any Jewish person from anywhere in the world to immigrate there and claim citizenship. Critics, however, argue that Zionism has functioned like colonialism, pointing to the violent ethnic cleansing of the indigenous Palestinian population and the building of illegal settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories as evidence. The Balfour Declaration. In 1917, British Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour wrote a letter to Baron Rothschild, a wealthy and prominent leader in the British Jewish community. In the brief correspondence, Balfour expressed the British government's support for the establishment of a Jewish home in Palestine. This letter was published in the press 1 week later and eventually became known as the Balfour Declaration. The text was included in the Mandate for Palestine, a document issued by the League of Nations in 1923 that gave Great Britain the responsibility of establishing a Jewish national homeland in British-controlled Palestine. Zionism and World War II. As is well known, many Jews living in Russia and Europe suffered horrific persecution and death during Russian pogroms and under Nazi rule. In fact, most historians estimate that about 6 million Jews were killed in Europe during the Holocaust. In the years before and during World War II, thousands of European Jews fled to Palestine or other regions to escape hostility. After the Holocaust ended, Zionist leaders actively promoted the idea of an independent Jewish nation. With the end of Great Britain's mandate in Palestine and the British Army's withdrawal, Israel was officially declared an independent state on May 14, 1948. Jewish resettlement in Israel. The rise of Zionism led to massive Jewish immigration into Israel. As a matter of fact, about 35,000 Jews relocated to the area between 1882 and 1903. Another 40,000 made their way to the homeland between 1904 and 1914. It is important to note that most Jews, about 57% of them, lived in Europe in 1939. However, by the end of World War II, only about 35% of the Jewish population still resided in European countries. In 1949, more than 249,000 Jewish settlers moved to Israel. This was the largest number of immigrants to arrive in a single year. For this reason, the Jewish population in Israel increased from about 500,000 in 1945 to 5.6 million in 2010. Today, around 43% of the world's Jews live in Israel. Zionism today. Since it started more than 120 years ago, Zionism has evolved, and different ideologies, such as political, religious, and cultural, within the Zionist movement have emerged. In fact, many self-proclaimed Zionists disagree with each other about fundamental principles. Some followers of Zionism are devoutly religious while others are more secular. There is also the rise of the Zionist lefts that want a less religious government and support giving up some Israeli-controlled land in exchange for peace with Arab nations. The Zionist rights, on the other hand, defend their rights to the land and prefer a government based strongly on Jewish religious traditions. Advocates of the Zionist movement see it as an important effort to offer refuge to persecuted minorities and re-establish settlements in Israel. Critics, however, say it is an extreme ideology that discriminates against non-Jews. For example, under Israel's 1950 law of return, Jews born anywhere in the world have the right to become an Israeli citizen, while other people aren't granted this privilege. It is important to note that Arabs and Palestinians living in and around Israel typically oppose Zionism. Many international Jews also disapprove of the movement because they don't believe a national homeland is essential to their religion. While this controversial movement continues to face criticism and challenges, there's no denying that Zionism has successfully bolstered the Jewish population in Israel. As we can see, Zionism has become increasingly controversial over the past century owing to its perceived connection to Jewish supremacy and usage as an excuse to uproot and curtail the rights of Palestinian citizens. In fact, in an article for Al Jazeera, Israeli-American doctor of psychology Yoav Litvin claims that Zionism is a racist and settler colonialist movement, which opportunistically coops aspects of Judaism in an attempt to justify its criminal practices of apartheid and genocide of indigenous Palestinians.